I fell for my dad's best friend on Thanksgiving, and he didn't resist me. Thanksgiving was supposed to be just another family gathering. Turkey, stuffing, and the usual small talk with distant relatives. But this year was different. Because this time, he was there. My father's best friend. A man I had grown up knowing, respecting, desiring. I knew it was wrong. He was older, experienced, untouchable. But when our eyes met across the dinner table, when his hand brushed against mine just a little too long, I realized I wasn't the only one feeling this. Stay until the end, because this story is hot, forbidden, and impossible to ignore. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring you more stories you won't want to miss. Thanksgiving at my parents' house had always been the same, predictable, filled with forced smiles, and a dinner table crowded with relatives I barely saw the rest of the year. I had learned to go through the motions, help my mom in the kitchen, endure my uncle's outdated jokes, and pretend I didn't notice how my father and grandfather always managed to turn dinner into a political debate. But this year was different, because he was here. Nathan Pierce, my dad's best friend. I had known Nathan for years. He had been a constant presence in our lives, always showing up for football Sundays, backyard barbecues, and family gatherings. But something had changed since the last time I saw him. Or maybe I had changed. He wasn't just Dad's friend anymore. He was a man, a damn fine one. Nathan stood near the fireplace, a whiskey in his hand, his tailored shirt rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His dark hair was speckled with gray at the temples, but instead of aging him, it made him look more refined, more dangerous. And the way he looked at me when I walked in, like he saw me for the first time. I wasn't a kid anymore. I was 22, a grown man, and when his eyes dragged over me, slow, assessing, I felt it deep in my stomach. A pull, a warning, a challenge. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. This was a dangerous game, but one I wasn't sure I had the strength to walk away from. The first touch. Dinner was a blur. Conversations blended together. Laughter felt distant. The only thing I could focus on was Nathan. His voice, the way his fingers wrapped around his glass, the way his lips curved into a slow smirk when he caught me staring. At some point, my mother asked me to pass the mashed potatoes, and as I reached across the table, so did Nathan. Our hands touched. It was barely anything, just the briefest brush of skin against skin. But the second it happened, I felt my breath hitch. The warmth of his palm, the calloused strength of his fingers, the way he didn't pull away right away. My eyes snapped up to his, and that's when I saw it. That look, the flicker of something dark, something forbidden, something he shouldn't have let slip. My stomach tightened. He knew. He knew. He didn't say a word. He just held my gaze for a second too long before finally pulling back, his fingers trailing over mine like he wanted me to feel it. I did. I felt it everywhere. A moment alone. Almost. After dinner, the house became louder. Music, chatter, dishes clinking in the kitchen. I needed air, needed to breathe. So I slipped outside onto the back porch where the cold November air bit at my skin. I wasn't alone for long. The door creaked behind me, and then him. Nathan stepped out, the glow of a nearby porch light catching in his dark eyes. He had another drink in his hand, but his gaze, it was on me. "You always disappear after dinner," he said, his voice deep, smooth, like he wasn't standing way too close. I shrugged. Needed some air. He nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. The silence between us stretched, thick with something neither of us wanted to name. Then, finally, he spoke. "You've changed," he murmured, his voice quieter now. I turned to him, my pulse hammering. "How do you mean?" Nathan exhaled, shifting just a fraction closer. "You're different. Not a kid anymore." I knew what he was saying. I also knew what he wasn't saying, and the way his gaze dropped to my lips before flicking back to my eyes. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't imagining this. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. My whole body was on fire, but I didn't move. Neither did he. We stood there, inches apart, breathing the same air, knowing we were crossing a line we could never uncross. The tension was unbearable, exhilarating. Then, the back door swung open, and we jumped apart. My father, oblivious, casual, holding 2 beers in his hands. "Hey, what are you guys doing out here?" Nathan's expression shuddered. The warmth in his eyes, gone. I forced a tight smile. "Just talking." My father grinned, handing Nathan a beer. "Come on, let's head back inside. We're starting a game of cards." Nathan hesitated for half a second. Then, with a slow exhale, he nodded. "Yeah, let's go." I watched him walk away, my chest tightening, my heart racing. I had spent my whole life wondering what it would feel like to play with fire. Now I knew, and I wasn't sure I'd ever want to stop. I barely made it through the rest of the evening. The house was filled with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses. But I wasn't really there. My body sat at the kitchen table, watching as my father dealt the cards, pretending to be amused by my uncle's terrible jokes. But my mind, it was still out on that porch, still trapped in that moment with him. Nathan sat across the table, his expression unreadable, his movements casual. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled just a little too tightly around his glass. I wasn't imagining this. He felt it too. And that realization? It was dangerous. At some point, the game of poker turned into something else. It was a slow burn, a battle fought with stolen glances and subtle moves. Nathan placed his cards down with an easy smirk, his dark eyes locking onto mine for a second too long. I raised the stakes in the next round, not breaking eye contact. He called my bluff. My father was too busy laughing to notice the way Nathan's knee brushed against mine beneath the table, too busy pouring another drink to realize that every card we played had nothing to do with the game in front of us, and everything to do with the one we were playing in secret. By the time my mother called it a night, I could barely breathe. The air felt thick, charged. I needed to get away from him, from the heat between us, from the way my entire body was aching for something I couldn't have. I stood, stretching. "I think I'll turn in." Nathan leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. His lips parted slightly, like he was about to say something just for me. But then my father clapped him on the back. "Another round?" Nathan's mouth snapped shut. I turned, walking away before I lost control. I should have gone to bed. I should have shut my door, buried myself under the covers, and forced myself to sleep off this insane attraction. But instead, I lingered. I stood in the dimly lit hallway, my pulse racing, waiting for the sound of my father's voice to fade, for the weight of the house to settle. Then, just as I turned toward my room, his door opened. Nathan stepped out. He didn't say anything, didn't move at first. We just stood there, facing each other in the dark. Every ounce of common sense told me to walk away. Instead, I took a step forward. So did he. The hallway was small, too small. The heat of his body was everywhere, the scent of whiskey and something deeper, something purely him, filling the space between us. I parted my lips, a breath away from saying his name, but before I could, he reached out. His fingers grazed my wrist, barely there, but enough to send electricity through my veins. "Go to bed," he murmured. His voice was low, quiet, dangerous. I should have listened. I should have turned away, but I didn't. I stayed. And in that moment, I saw it. Not hesitation, not regret. Want. Raw. Unfiltered. Impossible to ignore. My heart pounded. My skin burned. I was playing with fire. And for the first time, so was he. Then, just as quickly as it had happened, he pulled back. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step away before I did something reckless, before I kissed him, before I begged him. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Good night." His door clicked shut behind him. I stood there, breathing hard, my chest rising and falling too fast. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing in that hallway, his fingers brushing against my skin, his voice low and dangerous in the quiet of the house. "Go to bed." But how could I? I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, my heart still pounding. My body felt restless, my mind tangled in thoughts I had no business entertaining. I had spent years pushing these feelings away, convincing myself they were nothing but harmless admiration. But tonight, I saw the truth. I felt it in the way he looked at me, in the hesitation before he pulled away. Nathan wanted me too. And that changed everything. The house was silent when I finally gave up on sleep. The soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound, marking the slow crawl of time. I slipped out of bed, my breath shallow, my pulse thrumming in my throat. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I needed to move. The kitchen was dark, the faint glow of the refrigerator light casting long shadows as I poured myself a glass of water. My hands were unsteady. My body still felt charged, like an electrical current hummed beneath my skin. Then I heard it, a creak in the floorboards. I turned, and there he was. Nathan stood at the entrance to the kitchen, wearing nothing but a pair of loose sweatpants. His hair was messy, his expression unreadable in the dim light. But his eyes told me everything. I swallowed hard. "Couldn't sleep?" He exhaled through his nose, stepping further inside. "No." His voice was rough, husky, like he had been lying awake just like me, thinking about things he shouldn't. I watched as he moved past me, opening the fridge, pulling out the orange juice like this was any other normal night, but it wasn't. Nothing about this was normal. I leaned against the counter, gripping my glass too tightly. "About earlier." Nathan paused. His shoulders tensed for a fraction of a second before he turned to face me, leaning against the opposite counter. "Forget about it." I let out a breathless laugh. "You really think I can?" His jaw tightened. "It was a mistake." It wasn't. We both knew it. I shook my head, stepping forward before I could stop myself. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't feel it." Nathan's fingers curled around his glass, his grip white-knuckled. "Don't do this." "Do what?" I pressed. Another step closer. His breath hitched, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven movements. "Push me." "But what if I want to?" Silence. Thick, suffocating. He closed his eyes for a long moment, exhaling sharply before setting his glass down with deliberate slowness. When he looked at me again, something had shifted. Heat, restraint, and something darker beneath it. "This can't happen," he muttered, but he didn't step away. I was close now. Too close. close enough to see the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Then tell me to stop," I whispered. Nathan's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched against the counter. His breathing was ragged, like he was fighting a battle he was destined to lose. And then he turned, his hands gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. I waited, my heart hammering, but he didn't move, didn't look at me, didn't say a word. The message was clear. I closed my eyes, forcing down the ache in my chest. Then, without another word, I stepped back and walked away. But I knew one thing for certain. Nathan Pierce was cracking, and sooner or later, he was going to break. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of roasted coffee and the lingering warmth of last night's turkey. The house had settled into the usual post-Thanksgiving routine: dirty dishes stacked high, conversations murmuring over breakfast, and my father flipping through the newspaper like it was any other morning. But nothing about today felt normal, because Nathan was there. Sitting across the kitchen island, coffee in hand, looking so effortlessly composed while I was barely holding myself together. He didn't glance at me. Not once. He was too busy talking to my father, nodding along as they discussed football, investments, or whatever meaningless topic allowed him to pretend that nothing had happened last night. I should have done the same. I should have sat down, poured myself some coffee, and acted like I hadn't spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by the ghost of his almost touch. But I couldn't, because I felt it, the tension, thick and suffocating, buzzing beneath the surface like a live wire. He could pretend all he wanted, but I knew. Nathan was avoiding me, and it only made me want him more. I grabbed a mug, filling it with coffee, willing my hands to stay steady. My mother bustled around the kitchen, setting out plates, completely oblivious to the silent war waging between her son and her husband's best friend. Then, just as I reached for the sugar, Nathan moved. His hand brushed against mine, just a whisper of contact, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt of heat through my veins, enough to make my breath catch. I felt him stiffen, his fingers pulling back so quickly it was like I'd burned him. I turned my head, heart hammering, but he refused to look at me. Coward. "Morning, boys," my mother said cheerfully, completely unaware of the storm brewing at her kitchen counter. "We're taking the Christmas decorations out of the garage after breakfast. Hope you're both ready to help." Nathan cleared his throat, finally breaking the unbearable silence. "Sounds good." I barely heard him. I was still reeling from that single fleeting touch, from the way he reacted like I was dangerous, like I was something he had to resist. But what if he didn't? The thought sent a thrill through me, dangerous and intoxicating. I wanted him to break. I wanted to see how much longer he could last before he stopped pretending. And I was done playing it safe. As I took a slow sip of coffee, I let my knee graze against his beneath the table. A small movement. Intentional. Nathan tensed instantly. His grip on his mug tightened. His jaw locked. But he didn't pull away. He stayed. And that was all the confirmation I needed. This wasn't one-sided. Nathan Pierce wanted me, even if it destroyed us both. I took another sip, swallowing down the smirk threatening to form. Let the games begin. The day dragged on in slow motion. The house was alive with activity. My mom directing the unpacking of Christmas decorations, my dad untangling lights, my uncle already complaining about the cold. It was the same as every other year, except it wasn't, because Nathan was there, and everything between us had changed. I could feel him, even when I wasn't looking. His presence followed me like a phantom, setting my nerves on edge, making my skin feel too tight. Every time he moved, every time he spoke, I felt it, that slow burn, the unbearable tension that neither of us wanted to name. He was trying to keep his distance, but I wasn't going to let him. I waited until we were alone, away from my father, away from my mother's watchful eyes. He was in the garage, digging through a box of old ornaments, his back turned to me. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. Nathan stilled. I saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way his fingers curled around the edge of the cardboard box like he already knew what was coming. "You've been avoiding me," I said quietly. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "This again?" I stepped closer. "You can't even look at me." Nathan reached inside the box, pulling out an old ceramic Santa Claus. He inspected it, his face unreadable. "You're imagining things." That was a lie. I had imagined this, plenty of times. But last night, that had been real. I moved to stand beside him, close enough that I could see the way his jaw clenched, the muscle ticking beneath his skin, close enough to push him. "You can pretend all you want," I murmured, my voice lower now. "But I know what I saw last night." Nathan set the ornament down with slow, deliberate movements. "You don't know anything." I let my fingers brush against his wrist, just for a second, just enough to watch him react. He sucked in a sharp breath, his body going rigid, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the workbench. "Don't," he said, but his voice wasn't strong. It was barely a whisper. I took another step, the tension between us stretching so thin it was on the verge of snapping. "I think you want me to," I said softly. Nathan's eyes flicked up, finally meeting mine. And what I saw there? Not hesitation, not reluctance. Hunger. Raw, unfiltered, desperate. He wanted this. He wanted me, but he was still fighting it. "Walk away," he warned. I didn't move. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was rough now, laced with frustration. "This is a mistake, a line we can't cross." I tilted my head, letting my fingers trail up his forearm. "Then tell me you don't want to." His breathing was uneven now, his body so tense I thought he might break apart right in front of me. But then, he grabbed my wrist. Not hard. Not to push me away. Just holding. Like he was torn between pulling me closer and saving himself. I stared at his hand on my skin, at the way his fingers wrapped around me like they belonged there. My heartbeat was thunderous, drowning out everything else. "You're playing with fire," he murmured. "So are you," I whispered back. And then... The garage door swung open. We jumped apart, too fast, too guilty, too obvious. My father stepped inside, oblivious to the wildfire he had just interrupted. "You guys find the Christmas lights yet?" Nathan turned away, clearing his throat. "Yeah, almost." I didn't move. I just watched him, watched the way his hands trembled as he picked up a strand of tangled lights. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The rest of the evening was torture. Nathan avoided me like his life depended on it, but I saw the way his hands shook when he poured himself a drink, the way his jaw clenched every time I was near. He was losing control, and we both knew it. When everyone finally turned in for the night, I lingered in the hallway. I wasn't ready to let this go, and neither was he. His door opened. We stared at each other in the dim light, breathing the same heavy air, the tension so thick it was suffocating. "You should go to bed," he said, but his voice was wrecked. I stepped closer. "No." Nathan exhaled sharply. Then, in one swift move, he grabbed me, pulling me inside his room. The door clicked shut behind us. And just like that, we crossed the line.